Cyber-vigilantism is on the rise in regional Australia, and it's in response to a rise in crime in many towns across the country. Many people living in towns from Connemara in WA to Maryborough in Queensland and Alice Springs in the Northern Territory have been victims of crime, and sometimes very serious crime. People's anger with what's going on in their towns often spill out in the stuff they post on local community Facebook pages. Every day, you can see posts of photos of young people, often with their faces showing, being accused of getting up to no good. In Kalgoorlie in 2016, this anger spilt out on the street.
Tensions in the town escalated into violent riots 2.5 weeks ago when 14-year-old Elijah Doughty died after he was allegedly hit by a ute while riding a motorbike.
And the town erupted.
A 55-year-old man was charged with manslaughter, sparking the protest. Hundreds of people hurled rocks and bottles at the courthouse, police officers and damaged police cars. Community leaders say tensions were already high. Residents were frustrated over teen crime and their anger was fuelled by racist abuse on social media.
6 years later, TikTok and Facebook posts continue to inflame underlying tensions around youth crime and race across regional Australia. I'm Sinead Mangan and this is Australia Wide, coming to you from Wadjuk Country, Perth. Recent vigilante events in Queensland have captured media attention.
Come on out and face the music.
Dozens of people from an anti-crime group descended the homes of supposed offenders who were identified on social media in Rockhampton yesterday.
Some of the information's quite wrong, and in fact, the stuff on social media is pure speculation.
Storming a suburban home demanding answers.
The town wants to talk to you.
A group of vigilantes fed up with youth crime are quickly met with the force.
You won't do your job properly.
Right,
it's civilians doing your job for you.
Fastest police response I've ever seen, and it's when these are in danger. I know you guys are sick of it. It's time you all stand with us.
Some ugly scenes as vigilantes in the central Queensland city of Rockhampton came face to face with police earlier this month. They were surrounding a residence they believed was home to alleged offenders. The large group had come together after a call out on social media. While it was a confronting scene, it's not an isolated incident, and you don't have to look far in local community Facebook pages for towns across regional Australia to see posts calling for an action on crime. Communities are frustrated by what they see as an inability by police and courts to address rising youth crime rates, and they're venting their frustrations online. Now, while vigilante action is not a new phenomenon, social media is enabling large groups of people to communicate quickly and mobilise. In many cases, it's Indigenous young people who are the target of these social media posts, and the comments the posts attract are often thinly veiled or, in some cases, overtly racist. We're taking a look at this issue on Australia Wide today, and to do that I'm joined by Dr Terry Goldsworthy, who's a criminologist based at Queensland's Bond University, and he spent decades working in the police force. Thanks for joining us, Terry.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And also Professor Chris Cunneen from the University of Technology Sydney's Jumbunna Institute for Indigenous Education and Research. And he's been looking specifically at how community justice and vigilantism in Australia are exercised through social media and the impact that has on Indigenous youth. Nice to chat, Chris.
Thanks, Sinead.
And also Professor Cheryl Kickett-Tucker AM, a Wadjuk Noongar Aboriginal from Western Australia. She's worked with young Indigenous people in Kalgoorlie in WA in the wake of the death of Elijah Doughty, a 14-year-old Indigenous boy who died after being run over in 2006. Thanks for joining us, Cheryl.
Thank you.
Now, we're going to start with the state of Queensland, Terry, where there, as we've heard, there's been some recent vigilante action in regional communities. What do you put those events down to?
Look, I think there's a broader crime issue bubbling along in Queensland. If you have a look at the latest Queensland crime report produced by the government, it tells us that there's been a 7% increase in the crime rate overall, a 12% increase in property crime, personal crime has gone up 45% the rate, and we've seen a reduction in police enforcement activity. So, you know, that's the overlay. And then within that, you have a focus in the media on youth offending. What we do know in terms of youth offending is that as a proportion of offenders, they've risen in the last 12 months from 16% to 18% of offenders in Queensland. And they're overrepresented in offences like unlawful use of motor vehicles, unlawful entry and robbery, where they account for more than 50% of offenders in those types of offence categories. So there's a sense of frustration. Just this week there was an email fupo, I guess you could say, from the Premier's office where someone was complaining about being a victim of multiple crimes, and the email was sent back with the quote, just send the usual response. So there's a sense of frustration out there in the community, I think, and it's understandable, but some of the reactions are something that you wouldn't be condoning.
Chris, you've looked deeply into this rise in vigilantism specifically, and you've heard Terry there say that there is an uptick in youth crime. How big a role does Facebook play with all of this?
Look, I think it plays a very significant role, and it's, in the kind of longer term, it's very recent. It was really between 2004 and 2010 that we had a whole range of new social media platforms that came on the market for the first time, Facebook and Twitter, YouTube, Instagram and so on. And really from around 2010 onwards, we see the rise of these groups, not only on Facebook, but that's one that probably receives the most attention, set up in a number of communities throughout Australia. I mean, there's no shortage of finding these groups. We joined several of them so we could see and collect the posts that were being put there. And I think really it's transformed communication between people. The old media, the traditional media sends out stories, and whereas this form of media allows thousands or tens of thousands of people to interact relatively instantaneously and provide information to be able to come together for good or for violence. And I think we've seen multiple occasions over the years of violent vigilante activities which have been generated, if you like, not necessarily directly caused on a one-on-one basis, but certainly generated through these Facebook groups. So I think it's really important, and it's quite a kind of, well, I'd say a dangerous turn of events, really. As we've already discussed, much of it is racialised, much of it is targeted against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people.
It is remarkable when you look at these posts how comfortable people are expressing hate online. And like you said, Chris, you don't have to go far to see it, to find these Facebook posts. I'm interested, Terry, from a policing point of view, when does it go from something someone is comfortable saying on Facebook to something someone is happy to share, say if they're at a barbecue or at the school gate? The level of hate that you can see in some of those posts, that this is my opinion while I'm anonymous. But now I'm kind of moving from the anonymous into the real world, and I'm happy to share this.
Yeah, look, I mean, it's like anything on social media. If you're a keyboard warrior and you can't be identified, you're probably going to be more verbose and more outlandish in your claims and more vicious in your comments. I think that's just natural human behaviour to some degree. But I guess, you need to be careful if you're going to be on there making these kind of comments that lead to vigilantism. If some act occurs at the end, that you're not seen as being a party to some kind of offence that occurs, as in a counsellor, so someone who incites people to go and commit a criminal offence. So people need to be very careful there. I mean, we also have, the criminal offence of defamation as well as the civil offence of defamation in Queensland. So even though you think you're anonymous, usually if you dig hard enough, you can identify who's on the end of the comments. So I think people should think very carefully before they engage in, comments without any basis on social media, because eventually they will be identified and found out.
Because you work quite closely with the police and have spoken to cops. Do they do that? Do they chase these things down?
Well, no, it's not a common occurrence. And as we just heard, social media is, I guess, burgeoned in the last 10 to 15 years. But you'll only see the police, I guess, looking at social media when it provides evidence of another primary offence external to it. So if you saw a house burned down as a result of vigilante action, they would go to the social media to use that as evidence to support the primary offence of the arson. They're not necessarily, I don't think, looking for some kind of evidence of threats or whatever else under the criminal code of social media posts themselves. It's usually an adjunct to another offence.
Chris, when you've looked into these Facebook posts and social media, have you noticed it going from the anonymous into the real world? What happens when this anger kind of online spills out into the real world?
Well, I think when we start to investigate this, I mean, one of the things that was probably most shocking about it all is that people take no care in disguising themselves. I mean, you can look at any one of these Facebook groups at any time and you can have the vilest denigration of Aboriginal people. You can have direct calls for violence, very direct calls for violence. And the people are not anonymised. Their name's there, often where they work, is there. There's no hiding behind anonymity in relation to this. And I think, that's really important for the broader situation, I think, is that these groups provide legitimacy, if you like, to very direct forms of racism and racist violence. I'm sure Cheryl's investigation into Kalgoorlie would have seen quite clearly that the Facebook group there was calling for direct violence, and the people have their names there. They're not hiding at all.
Well, let's look at what happened in Kalgoorlie. So we're going back to 2016, and a young Indigenous boy, Elijah Doughty, died after being run over in the street. And this is how it was reported at the time.
2 months ago, a 14-year-old boy was at the gully with a stolen motorbike. He was allegedly hit by a ute and killed. The 55-year-old driver of the ute is white. He's the owner of the stolen motorbike. The 14-year-old victim is Aboriginal, and tensions between black and white in town erupt.
Now, that was in 2016. Cheryl, you worked intimately with the community after Elijah Doughty's death. What did you find out at that time about what was happening in the community in Kalgoorlie before Elijah died? Was there a build-up to this situation?
Yeah, I guess so. Look, I've got family in that area there, so you hear research is one thing, but when you hear what's really going on the ground, that's another thing. And I think in some of these country towns where there's a small pockets of people with different views on life and living, these sorts of incidences will be top of mind for a lot of them. But when we went out to Kalgoorlie to I guess it was like a reactive gesture by the federal government at the time to, after this had happened, what's the situation with the kids out there? How is life for them, for Aboriginal kids, and what's going on? And we were commissioned to do some research out there, and we did that research alongside the kids who we co-designed this instrument to find out about, what life was like and what was going on. But one of the biggest things that came out of it was 60% of the kids we interviewed, and 70% of the kids who we interviewed in the town that were Aboriginal, 62% of them said that place is boring.
Right.
So when you've got a place that's boring and doesn't offer very much to them, and then they're being pigeonholed by the rest of society, it's a mix for absolute disaster. And a lot of these kids, over 33% of them, were experiencing high and very high levels of psychological distress, none of which have been addressed by the federal government since that report was done. Not even one of those recommendations were attended to at all. And it's now 2023. 7 years have passed and nothing's changed.
Because you put together this report called the Gutu report, it was lodged with the federal. You don't think there was any shift at all after that? There was no effort at all to change things for those kids?
Not at all. That was a reactive response by the federal government at the time. And it really, for me as an Aboriginal person, as a researcher who goes back to that community quite a lot, my heart is gutted that, nothing was followed up in regards to the kids' wishes there, and to put some programs and activities there that they wanted, not what, a Care Bear or another organisation wanted to do with the kids. This is what the kids said themselves, and none of it was carried out.
What did they want, Cheryl?
Let's look at this motorcycle, right? So one of the things they wanted was to have a motorcycle track, and we workshopped some ideas with them, having a mechanical shop, learning how to, get old bikes, put them together, fix them, do safety equipment with them. They could have become mechanics in their own right, and having a space and a place out in the bush where they can go ride, with supervision. That was a big request from particularly the boys, and with the girls overall, we thought if we ran a Guthul Summit again, like what we did, to disseminate the information, it could become like a Gama for the kids in the desert region on the same sort of scale. So these kids were actually trained for 3 months to be event managers of the Guthul Youth Summit. And all that skill's gone now. One of the recommendations was to have a festival, a youth festival with elders coming in to do the same sort of format as Gama, but in the goldfields. So the kids would have a job and security and something to look forward to, rather than become what society wanted them to become. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. The noise and the sweet stories of goodness and positivity and strength-based aren't there. So, of course, they're going to listen to the dominant forces of how to be, which is not really our way at all.
You had a very definite plan there. It wasn't a lack of money. Was it? What was the reasons for not going ahead? Did you feel like it was a box ticking exercise, Cheryl?
Absolutely. God, you just need to look at the closing the gap indicators in this country. They're all going in the wrong direction. Our people are qualified. We got qualified by the Wadjala institutions. We're qualified in our Aboriginal institutions with our people, and yet we're still not a safe bet for the government to allow us to do our business. To be able to make a change in these communities that is generational from grassroots right through for generations to come. On top of that, they do not fund, in community development, in research, it takes a community to change a community and takes a generation to change a generation. The government, at all levels of government, are very siloed in their approach when we're holistic and we're very generational, but they don't throw any kind of resources that are generational worth, if you know what I mean.
Terry Goldsworthy, in working with police officers, because this has become an issue that's all wrapped up with that. Have you seen any good examples where, something like, a motorbike track, something practical, something that people want has worked out in a community and it's a positive approach to this whole situation?
Look, the QPS has highlighted some programs that have been effective in terms of engaging youth who have been on that cycle of committing offences. And I guess this just goes back to the multifactorial causations of crime that we see in young people. And, the government data for Queensland anyway tells us that 80% of them have used at least one substance. About 38% had used some form of methamphetamine. They come from houses that are impacted by domestic violence. A substantial number have mental health or behavioural disorders that may have been diagnosed or suspected. There's a lack of engagement in terms of education, and there's a lack of skills for employment. So, any programs, therapeutic programs that can successfully address those issues will stop the long-term offending cycle. So that is one aspect of how you deal with a youth crime crisis, if you want to put it that way.
Yeah, can I just add to this? There is a lot of money or resources being addressed when children have committed a crime. It's after the fact, and that's fine. We've got to address that. But the government needs to be courageous about putting more funds into early preventative issues, because even in the Guthu project in Kalgoorlie, the kids, before we even got to them, we're sharing things with us with their social emotional well-being, their psychological distress, the cultural identity, these really deep concepts that impacted their daily life. But before they committed a crime or before they went down the dark road, so to speak. Why aren't we putting more money in early prevention and looking at the strengths of a community and a child rather than their deficits, and throwing money into the deficits more so than in the preventative and early prevention spaces? And I really call out to the government to be courageous in that space and make that happen. Kids deep down are good people, good kids. They follow the wrong track. They might use substances and things like that, but that's masking the effects of something else. And it's the something else that's never being addressed. And that's my worry with all governments at the moment when working with Aboriginal kids and families.
Chris, I'd like to bring you back into the conversation. Now, we've talked about vigilantism and we've talked about social media, and social media is your area of expertise. It hasn't just been, and I'd be interested what Cheryl has to say about this as well, because it's not just vigilantes posting on Facebook, it's also kids encouraging other kids to get up to no good on TikTok. Do you think social media platforms like Facebook or TikTok have a role to play in shutting this down so that these situations aren't inflamed?
Certainly the private corporations that run these platforms have a responsibility, and we know that Facebook has been on multiple occasions very slow to shut down platforms, and we've just seen with the new owner of Twitter there's been a whole re-legitimation of various racist organisations in terms of access to Twitter. So certainly private corporations do have a role to play in this. The problem is, though, if we go back to look at Kalgoorlie, the Facebook page that was calling for running over Aboriginal children closed down after the death of a liar. Within a couple of weeks, a new Facebook page with a slightly different name was back up and running with around 12,000 members. The original one had 18,000 members, back up and running and calling for the same sorts of vigilante action. And so there is a lot that social media platforms themselves can do in terms of self-regulation around this, but it is also a difficult area to regulate simply by shutting something down. We know that the moderators, for example, of these Facebook pages allow these posts to go ahead. You know, it's not like you can just post anything on this. It has to be approved by a moderator, and the moderators see nothing wrong with allowing Facebook posts to go up which are calling for very direct violent action.
Terry, why don't you think people are leaving it to police to deal with crime?
Well, I guess you see the sense of frustration coming out in them. I mean, you know, we've had some stories here, I think Townsville or Kerwin, I'm not sure which one it was now, but the police had to retreat to the station with a number of stolen vehicles following them. And the stolen vehicles then blocked the police station. There were reports in Maryborough where we had the 3 women killed by a young person allegedly driving a stolen car. There were reports that the stolen vehicles were driving around town prior to the accident and driving past the police station, taunting them. So those kind of perceptions almost paint a police service that's unable to respond adequately to the crime issues.
But is it that communities are less safe, or is it that the perception?
Well, no. If you're looking at, you know, the level of criminality in Queensland, it's rising. The government reports clearly tell us that. So there is, you know, an increase in the crime rates, which is independent of any population increase. So there has been substantial rise in crime.
Cheryl, one of the reasons kids get up to no good is often because they lack power. They just don't feel like, you know, there's a lack of agency there. And in the same way, vigilantes are taking matters in their hands because they feel that, you know, they have to because there's no one doing anything for them. So what we're talking about is something very broken here. There's something broken going on. How do you start bringing a broken community back together?
Before I answer that, I just wanted to say one thing. The other sort of factor in all of this is poverty. When it's difficult for people to feed their kids, clothe their kids, live in a house, keep running water, it stresses the whole family unit, you know, and kids aren't immune to that. But how you change our community and our kids, I would start there first, and I would start with what we do here in WA and our small not-for-profit organisation is we spend a lot of time with kids, with families, chatting to them. The door's always open. There's lots of chances. There's lots of opportunity. There's no judgment. And we teach them skills to be able to make a decision. And if they make a decision, these are the consequences. Are you ready for that? And if you can't do it, here's the tools that you need, and you have to be ready to pull them out. So working with people with this vigilante kind of thought pattern, I am aware people get on that group too because they are fearful. If you speak to any non-Aboriginal person in Australia, a lot of people have never met an Aboriginal person in their life, let alone speak to one. So bridging that communication gap is a big issue, and that is a tiny start to a road worthy of travelling, and then eventually get both groups together. And it's going to take everybody. This is the issue, though. Is everyone willing to do this? You know, we're in Reconciliation Week, and, you know, I don't want it just to be a word. You know, we need action. But it's going to take time, dedication, and people with good hearts leading those fellows whose hearts need to be altered a little bit, because people's thoughts patterns depict their behaviour, and their thought patterns are attributed to their hearts and their minds. And that's a good place to start. It does take time. It takes a lot of time to get to know people. And after all, at the end of the day, we're human beings. That might sound simplified, but I know with our organisation, we've been operating for 2 decades, and that's our simplified approach, and it works. It does take time.
Well, I think it's a good place to end this conversation. I mean, huge issues that we're looking at today, and they're never going to be resolved in a 25-minute chat. Professor Cheryl Kickett-Tucker, thanks a million for joining Australia-wide. Professor Chris Cunneen from the University of Technology in Sydney, and Dr. Terry Goldsworthy. Thanks very much for giving your time to have this conversation.
Thanks, you.
Sinead.
Thank you.
And that's Australia-wide for this Wednesday. Love to hear from you. You can always get in touch with us online. I'm Sinead Mangan. Cheerio.